To understand the horror of this story, you have to understand the mask. We are taught to fear the shadows in the alleyway, the stranger with the gritted teeth, or the outcast muttering to himself on the street corner. We are evolutionarily hardwired to recognize danger when it looks like danger. But what happens when the monster looks exactly like the man you'd want your daughter to marry? What happens when the face of pure, distilled evil is handsome, soft-spoken, well-read, and charming? This is not a story about a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This is a journey into the fractured mind of a man who treated human beings like puzzles to be taken apart, a man who became a dark legend in Brazil, a boogeyman whose name is still whispered with a shudder. Chico Picadinho, the Suitcase Killer. Let's go back to where it all began. The year is 1966. The place is São Paulo, Brazil. It was a time of cultural explosion, a city growing rapidly into a concrete jungle, filled with jazz, samba, and a burgeoning middle class. In the heart of this bustling metropolis lived a young man named Francisco Costa Rocha. To his neighbors, Francisco, or Chico as he was affectionately known, was the golden boy. He was 24 years old, hailing from a wealthy, respectable family. He was the kind of young man who opened doors for the elderly, who could discuss philosophy and art over coffee, and who always appeared impeccably dressed. He was quiet, perhaps a bit introverted, but in a thoughtful, intellectual way. There was absolutely nothing about him that screamed predator. On August 4, 1966, the sun set over the city and the nightlife began to stir. Francisco was out that evening and he met a woman named Margareth Suida. Margareth was lovely, an Austrian ballad dancer, full of life, grace, and dreams. She was beautiful, with a vulnerability that perhaps appealed to Francisco's darker instincts, though at the time it just looked like a date. They went back to his apartment on Rua Aurora, a respectable building in the city center. Imagine the scene, music playing softly, drinks poured. The illusion of romance. Margareth had no reason to be afraid. She was with a gentleman, but inside that apartment, something snapped. The switch flipped. The polite, affluent young man vanished, and something primal and terrifying took his place. We don't know the exact moment the conversation died and the violence began, but the police reports paint a picture of sudden, explosive brutality. Francisco didn't just attack Margareth. He unleashed a torrent of rage that is difficult to comprehend. He strangled her. The intimacy of strangulation tells us something about him right from the start. He wanted to feel the life leave. He wanted control. If the horror had stopped there, it would have been a tragedy, a brutal murder, but perhaps not the stuff of nightmares. But Chico wasn't done. And this is where the story shifts from a crime drama into a horror movie. Faced with the body of the woman he had just killed, Francisco didn't panic and run. He didn't call the police in a fit of remorse. He went to the kitchen. He retrieved scissors and a knife. Over the next several hours, while the city of São Paulo slept unknowingly around him, Francisco Costa Rocha went to work. He dragged Margareth's body into the shower with a surgical, detached precision that would later baffle psychiatrists. He began to dismember her. He cut her into small, manageable pieces. It wasn't chaotic, it was methodical. He washed the blood away as he worked. His goal was erasure. He wanted to make Margareth disappear, literally reducing her to objects that could be packed away. He had a suitcase, a standard travel suitcase. He packed the remains of the beautiful Austrian dancer inside it, piece by piece. But the grim reality of biology is that a human body is difficult to hide. He couldn't fit everything. The sheer logistics of his atrocity began to overwhelm him. When the dawn broke, the perfect neighbor was surrounded by the carnage of his own making. The facade had cracked. When the authorities eventually entered that apartment, the scene that greeted them was something out of Dante's Inferno. The smell of blood was heavy in the air. The suitcase was there, a mute testament to the depravity that had taken place. Francisco was arrested, and the news hit the Brazilian public like a physical blow. The press couldn't reconcile the two images: the handsome, wealthy boy from a good family and the butcher of Rua Aurora. It didn't make sense. During his interrogation, Francisco was eerie. He was calm. He spoke about the event as if describing a bad dream or something that had happened to someone else. He claimed he had blacked out, a convenient defense for a monster. The psychiatrist descended upon him, eager to study this anomaly. They poked and prodded his mind, looking for the source of the evil. Was he insane? Was he a psychopath? Or was he just a spoiled brat who broke his toys? When he was bored, he was convicted. Of course, the evidence was overwhelming. He was sent to prison, effectively vanishing from society. The people of São Paulo breathed a sigh of relief. The monster was in a cage. Justice had been served. They thought the story was over. They thought that Chico Picadinho was a dark chapter of the past, a cautionary tale about trusting strangers. But they were wrong. Because the most terrifying part of Francisco Costa Rocha's story isn't the crime he committed in 1966. It is what happened next. The system that was designed to protect the public was about to make a catastrophic mistake. They looked at the well-behaved, polite prisoner and thought he was cured. They were about to open the cage. Iron bars are supposed to hold the body, but they cannot contain the mind, especially a mind as sharp and manipulative as Francisco's. When he entered the prison system in the late 60s, the other inmates saw a soft, rich boy who wouldn't last a week. They were wrong. Francisco didn't just survive, he thrived. He became the model prisoner, the gold standard of rehabilitation. While other men sharpened shanks or planned reists, Francisco sharpened his intellect. He spent his days in the prison library, devouring books on psychology, philosophy, and law. He didn't just read, he studied the very doctors who were treating him. He learned their language. He learned what they wanted to hear. When the psychiatrists sat down to interview him, Francisco could quote Freud and Jung back to them. He constructed a narrative of a young man who had been momentarily possessed by a temporary insanity. A man who was now fully aware of his actions and deeply remorseful. He was so convincing, so utterly charming, and seemingly harmless that he achieved the impossible. In 1974, after serving only 8 years for the brutal dismemberment of Margareth Suida, the system decided he was cured. Let that sink in. 8 years, he was released back onto the streets of São Paulo, a free man. The doctors signed the papers, the parole board stamped the forms. They unleashed him. Confident in their assessment that the monster was gone, Francisco returned to society, got married, and even secured a job. For 2 years, he wore the mask of sanity perfectly to the outside world. He was a success story of the Brazilian penal system, but deep in the recesses of his brain, the dark wiring hadn't changed. The urge wasn't gone. It was just dormant, waiting for the right trigger, waiting for the mask to slip again. The date is October 15, 1976, 2 years after his release. The setting is ominously familiar, an apartment in the city center, this time on Rua Rio Branco. The atmosphere is thick with the humid heat of a Brazilian spring. Francisco meets a woman named Ângela de Souza da Silva. Like Margareth before her, Ângela was young, vibrant, and completely unaware of the history walking beside her. She didn't see the suitcase killer from the decade-old headlines. She saw a polite, engaging man inviting her back to his place. They went up to his apartment. The door clicked shut. The world outside continued to spin. Traffic honked. People shouted on the sidewalks. But inside that room, time began to loop. It was a terrifying case of déjà vu. We can only imagine the conversation, the slow degradation of the atmosphere from friendly to menacing. At some point, the facade dropped, the polite intellectual vanished, and the butcher returned. The violence that followed was almost a ritualistic reenactment of his first crime. It wasn't just a murder, it was a compulsion. Francisco attacked Ângela with the same explosive ferocity he had shown 10 years prior. He strangled her. The intimacy of the kill, the physical dominance, the silence of it, it was his signature. But once again, death was not the end. Death was merely the beginning of his process. With Ângela's lifeless body lying in his apartment, Francisco didn't flee. He didn't panic. He reverted to his work. He dragged her to the bathroom. This is where the story becomes truly stomach-churning. He didn't just dismember her, he dissected her. Using a knife and a scalpel, he spent hours taking the body apart, with the focus of an anatomist. This wasn't a frantic attempt to hide evidence anymore. This was something else. This was gratification. He removed organs. He severed limbs. The precision was horrifying. He spent the entire night with the corpse, surrounded by the smell of blood and the sound of running water, trying to wash away the sins he had committed. He began the process of disposal, the same logistical nightmare he had faced in 1966. He cut the body into smaller pieces to fit them into bags, to flush what he could, to erase Ângela from existence. He was trying to solve the puzzle of the body again, but the sheer volume of the remains was too much. The plumbing couldn't handle it. The bags were too heavy. As the hours ticked by and the morning sun threatened to expose him, the reality of his situation began to close in. But this time, there was a difference. This time, the police weren't just looking for a murderer. They were about to stumble upon a ghost they thought they had exorcised. When the discovery was made, it sent a shockwave through the entire nation that is hard to describe today. A neighbor, disturbed by strange noises or perhaps a suspicion that something was wrong, alerted the authorities. When the police kicked down the door, they didn't just find a crime scene, they found a nightmare. The bathroom was a slaughterhouse, and standing amidst the horror was Francisco Costa Rocha, the man who was supposed to be cured, the man who had charmed the psychiatrists. The suitcase killer had struck again, almost exactly to the letter of his original crime. The investigation was short because the guilt was undeniable, but the psychological impact was long-lasting. The police were baffled. How could a man who seemed so normal, who had passed every test the state threw at him, commit such an atrocity twice? The details of the crime scene were leaked to the press, and the public revulsion was absolute. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was the work of a predator who hunted women for sport and pleasure. They found his tools. They found the evidence of his methodical nature. The realization hit everyone at once. The system hadn't fixed him. It had simply given him a vacation. The fear in São Paulo was palpable. Every woman looked at the man next to her and wondered, is he another Chico? The betrayal felt personal. The state had promised them safety, and instead, it had released a wolf back into the sheepfold. The capture of Francisco Costa Rocha, for the second time, wasn't a high-speed chase or a dramatic shootout. It was a surrender to the inevitable. When the police arrived at the apartment on Rua Rio Branco, the evidence was so overwhelming, so grotesque, that denial was impossible. Francisco didn't fight. He didn't scream. He simply allowed the handcuffs to be placed on his wrists, his face a mask of strange, detached calm. It was as if he had just finished a difficult day at the office rather than a night of butchery. He confessed almost immediately, and his confession chilled the detectives to the bone. He spoke of an uncontrollable force, a compulsion that overrode his logic. He admitted that when he was with a woman, the urge to possess her completely, to reduce her to an object he could control and dismantle, became overpowering. The monster wasn't hiding anymore. It was sitting in the interrogation chair, politely asking for a glass of water. The trial that followed was a media circus of unprecedented proportions. Brazil was in shock. The man they had released, the reformed intellectual, had proven the experts spectacularly wrong. The public demanded vengeance. The psychiatrists who had signed his release papers were scrutinized, their careers tattered. This time, there would be no leniency. Francisco was sentenced to over 20 years in prison, but the numbers on the paper felt meaningless against the weight of his crimes. He was sent to the House of Custody and Treatment in Taubaté, a facility designed for the criminally insane. And there, he began the strangest chapter of his life, a chapter that continues to this day. In prison, Francisco once again became the model inmate. It is a terrifying paradox. He is polite to the guards, he is helpful to other prisoners, and he spends his time gardening, painting, and reading. If you met him today, you would see a frail, white-haired old man who looks like a kindly grandfather. He speaks softly. He is articulate. He discusses politics and literature with a keen intelligence. But this grandfather is the longest-serving prisoner in Brazilian history. Under Brazilian law, no one can be kept in prison for more than 30 years. That is the hard limit. By the late 1990s, Francisco had served his time. Technically, legally, he should have been released. He had paid his debt to the state. The calendar said he was a free man, but society said no. The fear of Chico Picadinho was so deep, so primal, that the legal system had to break its own rules to keep him locked up. As his release date approached, a panic set in. The media ran stories reminding everyone of the suitcases, the scissors, the scalpels. The prosecutors and psychiatrists scrambled for a solution. They knew that if he walked out those gates, he would kill again. Francisco himself has at times admitted this. In rare moments of candor, he has confessed that the urge is still there, dormant but alive. He is a predator who knows he cannot stop hunting. So, the state used a legal loophole. They declared him civilly incapacitated, essentially arguing that he was insane and unable to care for himself or live in society. They transformed his prison sentence into indefinite psychiatric custody. He is not technically a prisoner anymore. He is a patient who can never be discharged. Today, Francisco Costa Rocha remains in custody. He is over 80 years old. He has spent more of his life inside a cell than outside of one. He exists in a strange limbo, a living ghost of a bygone era of crime. He watches the world change on a television screen. He saw the end of the military dictatorship, the rise of the internet, the turn of the millennium, all from behind the high walls of Taubaté. He receives letters, sometimes from people fascinated by his macabre celebrity, sometimes from students of psychology, trying to understand the mind of a monster. He answers them with the same polite, detached tone he used when he invited Margareth and Ângela into his apartment. The story of Chico Picadinho is not just a story about murder. It is a story about the failure of our understanding of evil. We want to believe that evil is ugly, that it is loud, that it is obvious. We want to believe that with enough therapy, enough time, and enough medication, any broken soul can be fixed. Francisco proves us wrong. He proves that some darkness is permanent. He is the living embodiment of the psychopath who wears the mask of sanity so perfectly that he can fool the experts, the judges, and the world. He teaches us that the most dangerous monsters are the ones who can quote poetry while they sharpen the knife. As we close this file, we are left with an uncomfortable truth. The man who dismembered 2 women and packed them into suitcases is not a raving lunatic screaming at the walls. He is a quiet old man tending to a garden in a prison hospital. He is the nice guy next door, and he is still there, waiting out his days. A reminder that sometimes the only thing keeping the wolf from the door is a lock that must never, ever be opened. The suitcase killer may be caged, but the fear he planted in the heart of a nation will never truly die. Because we know now that he is real. And we know that there are others just like him, perhaps walking past us on the street right now, smiling, holding a briefcase, and opening the door for us.